Hello, everyone. I'm calling in from Nipaluna, Hobart. Remind you that this is the third of our briefings, and in this coverage, we're going to cover through to the February-April period of 2025. Claire, you'll hear from in the middle part of the presentation. As you know, these briefings are recorded. And on the next slide, we're just a summary of, actually, nobody goes back and looks at last week's weather report, really. And so why would you go back and look at any of these briefings, which we've got online? I hope it's because of the topics that we cover at the beginning and the end of these briefings. And so last time in 2024, we looked back at some past years that had been of interest to the group that was online, just to get a sense of, well, how does this year compare to something that's in my historical experience? And decision-making based on how things were last time is at least a little bit of a head start in terms of what you might do in response to extreme events. We also heard from Melissa Coleman, who talked about the New South Wales response plan. And to Claire and I, that's a leading example of how a jurisdiction is responding to these kind of briefings and taking that next step to think about what responses they will have, who needs to be in the communication loop. And I would say this is a great model to emulate around the country. Just an update, we know that there are draft marine heatwave response plans close to release in Tasmania and Western Australia, and I'd say that there are informal versions floating around. And so again, use this network to find out what others are doing in response to these events. Claire and I wanted to re-emphasise that our coverage here is national and we go pretty quickly around the whole country, and we can't touch on the detail of particular events. But under this briefing structure, we can also offer state and regional briefings. And Jamie, Claire and I and others meet together about every month or so, and we can offer, I'd call them state and regional briefings out of a group of people who participate here. We used them a fair bit last year, and I know that there's been a Tropical Australia one. Tassie did a couple of bespoke briefings last year. Irani's providing that for Western Australia, and Claire also does some coral reef specific ones in northeast and northwest Australia. And so if you go away thinking, perhaps as Ryan you did, I really would love to hear more about the freshwater implications of this, come back and seek what additional detail you can get there. And that can even be down to the next level here, actually industry specific briefings or conservation briefings or whatever it is. And so there's a whole cascade of information that we're working with as a community across Australia to provide. The ultimate reason for doing that is to lead to action plans and responses. And a particular side benefit is I hope it increases political awareness of around what climate is doing to the ocean on short and long time scales and how our community is collectively responding to that. And any political help we can ever get in that is always welcome. You will have been reading the paper over the past couple of weeks or looking online, and 2024, when we started these briefings last year, did turn out to be the warmest year on record, and it's quite a substantial breakthrough in terms of going past the 1.5 degree threshold, which has been an aspirational target out of the Paris Agreement. Globally, it was about 1.6 degrees, so it kind of, in a climate sense, it smashed through that barrier. That's definitely not a good news story. What that means, though, is that extreme events will continue to be prevalent. In Australia, at an annual average, Australia as well as the world experienced the warmest temperatures. And as long as we've been keeping records in Australia, it was the warmest in Australia's ocean. And again, on the right-hand side, you see how much the final red bar is exceeding the long-term average. The long-term average is based on a 1961 to 1990 period of time. And that's why the earlier years are typically blue. The later years are red, is because we have a long-term warming trend. But see how much more extreme that trend is getting. The ocean experienced about 0.8 degrees above the long-term average. That's less than the 1.6. So the ocean has a slower accumulation of heat, but it's much harder to turn around that. And so I expect this year to be close to this warm again, because the ocean won't oscillate very much compared to on land. So what does that mean? Why are we seeing this continued warming trend? And you all know it. It's that global emissions of carbon dioxide and methane are continuing to rise. At the moment, the projection is for 2024, because those data are not available yet, 37.4 gigatons. Think about where in your life you're either born or began operating as a professional, and work your way back on that graph to see how much that has increased over your professional or living lifespan. And it's a pretty dramatic plot from that view. So if we've gone past 1.5 degrees, where's the work to be done? The plot on the right-hand side shows for a range of things that we might care about: plant species, insects, coral reefs, extreme heat events such as we talk about here, or even loss of ice in the Arctic. If we stuck at 1.5 degrees, how much would the impact be? And then what happens if we end up sticking at 2 degrees of warming? It will be 2 times worse for loss of plants if we go to 2 degrees above the pre-industrial temperatures. Coral reefs, it'll go to 29% worse, or a 99% decline. And so there's a lot of work to be done between 1.5 and 2 degrees that will make things not nearly as bad. And I think that I'm probably thinking 1.5 is now the target to try and get back to, but don't let it go to 2 degrees because of how much worse things get. And that makes the work of this community in terms of trying to avoid the worst of these things now really important in our short-term responses. And marine heat waves, as an example, are something that we can provide a short-term response to until they become permanent. I think with that bright and cheery look at our world, Claire, you could take over and talk about the current ocean conditions.
Thanks, Alistair, for that handover. Hi, everyone. I'm talking to you here from Naarm or Melbourne. So same format. So welcome to all the old faces that have been at these briefings before, and welcome to any new ones. So we run through the current ocean conditions, what's happening at the moment around Australia. Then we look forward 3 months. So what we can expect in the next 3 months. And then as well as checking in on how the forecasts I provided last time, how well did the models do? So we'll kick off with the current ocean conditions. So continuing the story that Alistair laid out just now. So this is for December. We don't have the January values yet because we're just on the lucky last day of January. This plot here on the right-hand side is showing, in terms of deciles, what the sea surface temperature have been around Australia in December. So this light orange colour means it's in the top 10%, and that is the threshold for marine heat wave. The dark orange is highest on record, so since 1900. And you can see pretty much anywhere around Australia in December, on average, was in that top 10%. The couple of dark orange areas are Ningaloo and around the Pilbara coast, and also through the Bight, with the highest on record for December. So particularly in areas where December is already the hottest month, this is not the case around, for everywhere around Australia, but that's very warm conditions. On the right-hand side, similar plot to the one Alistair showed, but just for December, you can see that December was extremely warm. So on average, around Australia, it was 1 degree warmer than you would normally get in December. So particularly for species or coral reefs, for example, that have a very small temperature tolerance, 1 degree is a big deal. We put that in context, and this will feed into the discussion in the later part of our presentation around what's happening in WA at the moment. It has not just warm in December, it has been warm for the last few months. So same colour scheme, light orange, top 10% that's been recorded for that month, dark orange, hottest on record for that month. So you can see stepping through from August last year through to December, it's pretty much that orange colour the whole way around the coast. There are some areas that have been slightly cooler than, so the 8th or 9th decile, so still warmer than normal, but not quite as warm in October, November. But for the majority of the coastline, very warm, and it's been sustained. So part of the conversation here, and maybe for discussion afterwards, is around, it's not just the magnitude of the heat stress. It's not just how hot it is, it's how hot it's been in recent months that will determine the impacts on the systems that we're looking at, managing or fishing. Okay, if we take a global picture, so this is sea surface temperature again, so very top layer. This is from satellites. You can see the global picture here. Same story, everywhere around Australia is that pink colour. Anywhere that's pink, warmer than what you would expect for this week. So this is from the 20th to 26th of Jan. Anywhere that's blue is cooler than normal. Not a lot of blue on this plot. The only bit of blue that's really standing out here is what's going on in the Central Pacific. So during a La Nina, the typical pattern is a big cold water tongue across the Pacific. Now, as I'll show in the next few slides, there is not enough of the criteria have been ticked to call this event a La Nina, but this La Nina-like pattern is partly responsible for the heat we're seeing on the WA coast. And I'll explain a bit more about that in the next few slides. If we look at marine heatwave conditions around Australia, so this is from a Bureau product, but there's also more information here on the Marine Heatwave Tracker. So you can see daily snapshots if you want to have a look at your particular part of the coast. This is for, the date's fallen off, 21st to 27th of January. And you can see this area here lighting up on the Northwest Shelf and then down the coast as well. If you step through day by day, you can actually see this heat moving down the coast, and that's due to a cyclone off the coast here, but it's very warm. And I'd like to point out too that we don't see these severe marine heatwave conditions very often. So this is hotter than hot. Rest of the coastline also in a moderate marine heatwave. So still in that top 10% of what you'd expect. And if December or January is the hottest time of year for you, you're exceeding what you'd normally expect during your hottest month. If we look at the subsurface, so the marine heatwave plot I just showed is in the top 1 metre of the water. We know the fish and coral aren't living in the top 1 metre, but we have excellent ocean observations from satellite to be able to put that picture together. If we get down into the water, we stitch together all the observations we've got from buoys or floats and whatnot to have a look at what's happening at depth. So this is down to 300 metres. Anywhere red is warmer than you'd normally expect for this past week. Anywhere blue is cooler. You can see in some areas there's lots of little round sort of blue patches. They're cold core eddies. But you can see off the Northwest Shelf, given the focus, or one of the focuses of this briefing is around WA, it is very warm off the shelf. That means the heat extends from the surface all the way down to 300 metres. It takes more than a couple of breezy days to mix that heat away. So it's being, you see it at the surface and you see it at depth. If there's just a thin, warm layer at the surface, much easier for the wind or a bit of rain or cloudy day to mix it away and arrest that marine heat wave. You can also see heat down here off Tassie in the Western Tasman Sea and parts of New South Wales and a little in the Bight. But majority, the one that really stands out here is on the West Coast. Okay, so how did the forecast perform that I showed you mid-December last year? For the top 3 panels here, we've got the forecast from the first fortnight of or sort of the mid 2 weeks of December, then over Christmas to early January, and then the forecast for January. So these are the ones we presented on the 14th. This is what actually happened. So the model's done a pretty good job. You can see in the first fortnight, the Northwest Shelf was really lighting up here already. Very warm conditions, up around 2 to 2.5 degrees warmer than normal. And that's what we actually saw. Same in the next fortnight, so over Christmas, still really warm here. It was warm in the Coral Sea, through the Bight, and also down in the Western Tasman. And that's what we saw as well. The magnitudes were higher than the model got, but it did indicate those areas would be warmer than usual. Looking through to January, we haven't got the full January yet, but you can see it's very warm everywhere. The model did predict that, but maybe not the magnitude. One area that does stand out though is that Northwest Shelf, that it was predicting 2.5 or more degrees warmer than normal. So we're pretty happy with how the model performed over the summer. Not the results, but the fact the model caught that heat. If we look at our marine heatwave forecasts, so noting that these are a trial forecast, we're still testing them. They're not for public access yet, but we're working on that. Same 3 time periods, first fortnight, next fortnight, and then January. The model has also done a good job of capturing those marine heatwave conditions. It hasn't got these really high categories of marine heatwave, the strong to severe, But as I said, this is pretty unusual. You don't see these colours very often on a monthly marine heatwave forecast or observed. So it's hard for the models to get those super high extremes, but it had indicated this was a marine heatwave condition. So depends on where your trigger is for action. If it is there as a marine heatwave, then it would definitely have been triggered based on this forecast. And you can see that, so those areas lighting up. Through the Bight as well, we indicated or we predicted marine heatwave conditions through the Bight in that first fortnight through to the 2nd and through to January. And you can see that inshore, the models captured those conditions. So we always do that. We go back and have a look at how well our forecasts have captured those recent conditions to give us some confidence in what today's forecast is saying going forward. Okay, so we're looking through from February through to April. So same, so we've got the global picture here. So this is Feb through to April, and this is looking at sea surface temperatures again. The main reason we show this is to have a look at what's going on in the Pacific. So this Nino 3-4 region out here that I've marked by the box is one of the indicators we look at when we're talking about it. Is it a La Nina event? Is there an El Nino event going on? Or are we just in neutral conditions? So as I said, when we looked at the observations, this blue patch here is indicating cooler water than normal, and that is a typical indicator of a La Nina. Around Australia, you can see for the next 3 months, very high temperatures here on the west coast, so up around 2 to 3 degrees warmer than normal on average for the next 3 months. Also around Tassie and extending into the Tasman Sea are the two kind of key points for looking at Australia. We'll look at those in more detail the next couple of slides. Okay, so we're going to talk about ENSO now. So while we haven't ticked off all the criteria that have that indicate a La Nina is underway, some of the ocean indicators that the Bureau looks at do look like a La Nina. So what that means is the ocean conditions, so when you have a cool anomaly in the Western Pacific, that causes warm water to build up on the east coast of Australia. It flows down through the Indonesian through flow and down the west coast. And that's typically related to increased chance of marine heat waves on the WA coast. So even though we haven't declared a La Nina event, that pattern is contributing to the heat on the West Australian coast. I know there's a few online who are quite disappointed when these model comparison plots were taken off the public webpage. The Bureau is putting together an email circular that will come out once a month for those that would like this information. So if you would like these plots, let Jamie know and he'll pass them on to me and I'll get you onto that mailing list. But for those who are like, what is this plot? What we do at the Bureau is we have our own model that we run, that all of these forecasts are coming from, and then we also have a look around the world and see what other models are doing. So the top panel here is for February, March and April. So if these grey bars are in the white area, it's saying neutral conditions. It's not a La Nina, it's not an El Nino. There is only one model out of the 7, including ours, that is going for a La Nina, and that's NOAA. It's very late for a La Nina to occur. Normally we would see that happening at the end of the year, so December, November, December, rather than at the end of January. By March, all the models are agree that we're in neutral territory, looking at these ocean indicators, and same for April. You can see here, and this is the Bureau's model here, if this green line is within this white region, again, neutral. All the grey lines are all the model runs that we do, and we look how many of those fall in a La Nina category and how many in a neutral, and the majority are falling in neutral. IOD, for those on the west coast or interested in the Indian Ocean dipole, that's neutral and that is normal for this time of year. Usually that is active towards the end of the calendar year. Okay, so looking at rainfall and also air temperature, because that is important, particularly, I guess, for you, Ryan, you're on inland fisheries, but also those operating in the coastal margins. So wetter than normal season for Australia is, for most of Australia, north and east, is predicted for February through to April. So very wet in Queensland. So on the left is the chance of above average. And then if we look at the extreme areas, in the top 20%, it pulls out those areas here on the right. So you can see for a lot of the northwest, for those who are operating up here across NT and Queensland, there's a 2 to 2.5 chance, times greater chance of it being in the top 20% of rainfall for this season. So quite wet and compared to what you would normally expect. Southern WA and most of South Australia into Victoria, very much an average season forecast. Part of the reason we look at that when we're talking about marine conditions is you got rain, you got cloud, wind, That's stopping the sun warming the surface of the ocean, as well as wind mixing heat away. So that's part of the reason we look at these as well. Air temperature, pretty much the converse. Southwest WA, I think Clayton said it was 28 degrees in Mandurah and the border at the moment. Very warm air temperatures forecast for the next 3 months. So on the left, chance of it being above average. On the right, chance of it being very hot in the top 20%. So that southwest corner is reflecting those warm ocean temperatures as well. Also parts of Victoria and also Tasmania. And you can see the oceans are all around it are warm as well. So that checks out. Okay, into the water. Looking at the next 2 fortnights. So this is from the 27th of Jan through to 10th of Feb. I'm showing surface plots here, top 1 metre. So we've got sea surface temperature anomalies, so how much warmer than normal. This purple colour here for reference up around Exmouth, 2 to 2.5 degrees warmer than you would normally expect for this fortnight. That information feeds into the marine heatwave forecast below. So we look at these temperatures here and say how many of those above the 90th percentile or in that top 10% and above. And you can see the model's predicting a strong marine heat wave for the next fortnight, northwest shelf extending offshore and the full coast of WA. It's also indicating marine heat wave conditions across the Bight and around Tasmania as well. On the left here, this is our model skill. So the takeaway from this, anywhere that's green, the model has done a good job of predicting conditions at this time of year, this far ahead over the last 40 odd years. We go to the next fortnight. So we're now into Feb. So middle of Feb, 10th to 24th of Feb. The patterns are pretty much the same. So you can see warmth off the northwest shelf and extending down the WA coast through the Bight and around Tassie. Is warming up towards the north of the Coral Sea, but most of the heat stress is still in the southern part of Australia. We then turn that information into a marine heatwave category. Moderate marine heatwave conditions stretching from the Kimberleys pretty much. Most of this area is green, meaning that the model does a good job of predicting those sea surface temperatures in the past. Okay, now we're stepping out to March. So a reminder that the further out we're trying to predict, the less confidence we have in the forecast. However, we do look at that and measure it. And so this green panel here, you can see there's some white areas, which means the model typically doesn't do well when we're trying to forecast March from the end of January. But everywhere else you can see is green, means the model does a relatively good job. So it's pretty much the same story as what we've just shown through to Feb. Very warm from Exmouth down the coast, through the Bight, around Tassie. Coral Sea starting to warm up. However, this is relative to March. Hottest time of year for the Coral Sea is February usually, January, February. So your maximum temperature is not as high as it might be. WA, however, has 2 peaks in temperature, usually one around December, the other is March, April. So we're starting to add high anomalies onto a high background temperature just from the normal seasonal cycle. We get into the water, down to 300 metres, you can see that heat is down at depth as well. So there's a big reservoir of heat sitting below the surface, which means it's hard to shift. There's also a lot of heat sitting in the Western Tasman Sea down here and a bit through the Bight as well. If we translate that to marine heatwave, same story. The top panel here is showing what are the odds of getting a marine heatwave. Takes all our forecast information and looks at how many of the forecasts are in that top 10%. High probability, WA coast, Bight, and increasing probability too in the Coral Sea. And you can see that reflected when we collapse that down into a category. Moderate marine heatwave conditions for most of the Australian coast. And last one, so we're stepping out to April and you can see there's a bit more white on this bottom panel here, this model skill, because we're trying to predict out even further. But there is still skill in the model. So the model still can predict areas this far out this time of year. Again, same pattern, warm, southern part of Australia and northwest shelf. Anomalies are around 1.5–2 degrees. And now we're at the warmest time of year for this part of the coast. So that's on top of what you would normally expect this time of year. Heat content, very warm at depth, warm through the bight, warm in the Western Tasman. We convert that to marine heatwave conditions. You can see marine heatwave conditions for most of the coast. So sustained heat, heat at depth, seeing it at the surface, and it's for most of the coast for the next 3 months. Okay, I'll throw back to Alistair, and then at the end of this section, when we wrap it up, we'll have time for questions for Arani and Felicity and Rodney.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. So as you looked at those different regions of Australia for the upcoming months, you're probably thinking, well, so what does that mean for me? Let's take Tasmania as an example. The worst of the heat has occurred for the Tasmanian region now. And so we got through the summer, I hope, with fairly few effects of heat waves in Tasmania. While we experienced it, it tended to move to southern part of Tasmania quite quickly. So if you're an operator, a manager, a decision maker in Tasmania, I'd say you're in phase 4 on this plot. After you've gone through the worst of it, how did you go this summer? Did you do things differently compared to the previous summer? How did they work? And it's an opportunity to assess your long-term plans. And I say without, I just say, and be ready for next summer. So it's a chance to consolidate where you're at and get prepared again. In the Coral Sea and the Great Barrier Reef area, they're kind of still sitting at phase 1. And I think they've still got this increased risk of heat. It's accumulated a little bit in the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef. They're probably still doing this, making sure they're going to collect baseline data, revisiting the past impacts, and just wait and see really at the moment. On the West Coast, you're very clearly to me in phase 2 and phase 3. You've been through these briefings over the past couple of months where you saw that increased risk even from when we were forecasting La Nina conditions kind of at the end of last year's briefings. So you were prepared for stuff happening in Western Australia this year. The events have been forecasted and we've seen things like response plans developed, briefings to different ministers as we'll go through in the next slide. And our research community has got out there with data collection and early warning systems. And for some of you, very clearly, you're in a period now where you're going to have to adapt operations. When are you putting out young animals into aquaculture operations? What are we doing around fishery surveys? What are we doing around the locations where we're trying to collect additional data? If you had an opportunity, where would you be creating safe spaces for animals, as Tasmania did for handfish and will continue to look for into the future, this creating refugia? So depending on where you are in Australia, you've got these different options to be looking at. And I hope that you think very much when you look at the maps, what does that mean for the actions that I can be taking? Arani has provided an example of Western Australia's responses here. And so from their early warning, which Arani and I know began in about April last year when we were anticipating La Nina conditions, and La Nina conditions were associated with a 2011 heat wave that was very dramatic in Western Australia. So Western Australia is a bit forewarned about what these big events can do. Rodney and Arani are part of the Fisheries Climate Change team, and they bear responsibility for assimilating information from national briefings like this one, interacting with other communities that are gathering data, and then reporting that to the people who care about it in Western Australia. An update then has shown, for example, the progression of those events over time, and this between step 1 and 2 was an example of stepping up that level of alerting. And so at stage 1, when you think that moderate heat waves are coming, maybe you keep it in-house and you're just thinking about getting your plans in order. By the time it's got through to moderate heat waves looking likely, there was a lot more engagement kicking up. And so that engagement effort, I hope, has left to people better prepared. And again, Arani and the team have been participating in the behind-the-scenes work on what we present at climate briefings to make sure they had the most up-to-date information and they could get it when they needed it and not waiting for these 2 monthly briefing updates. I think a challenge when you're trying to do the briefings is that some people who need to make decisions are sometimes wrapped up in electoral cycles. And so we probably won't comment too much on it, but at a time when you really need government to take a leadership role, Western Australia finds itself in caretaker mode. And I imagine that's has possibly slowed down some of the things that we might like to communicate or might like to be actioned. And so how do you design a response plan that can be insulated against some of these political cycles? I leave that as an exercise for the reader. Arani shared this slide here, which just compares how the current evolution of the Western Australian event in the top row here between September and January compares with, in the second panel, this very strong 2011 event. And those of you who have living memory of what 2011 was like, you'll see that the heating has kind of begun earlier this occasion. Look at the 2 Septembers on the left-hand side. The Northwest Shelf heating had begun earlier. And so you've had that accumulated heat for a longer period of time. And corals don't like accumulated heat. And so that means that even if the temperatures drop off a bit, we're still worried about corals and their response. Stepping through to January, you can see that the marine heat wave had started to move further south in 2011, and we haven't really seen that yet in 2025. And so we're very interested in what the Lewin current is doing, what tropical cyclones are doing, because they influence the surface winds and how far you might see waters being pushed down by currents flowing south. Thank you. An example of the response plan then that Western Australia has in place is that the responsible agency, DPIRD, has chosen to put out a communication describing what's going on to the DPIRD staff and managers and a variety of other industry researchers and interest groups. I think those things continue to elevate awareness and talk about what's going on. They're able to use things that are available on the Bureau web pages, and these are updated more frequently than what we provide in the briefing. So part of our effort is to make sure all of those are available. Several issues have also, I think, elevated interest in Western Australia, and one of them in particular is a fish kill. Was the fish kill caused by the marine heat wave? Perhaps too early to be a direct answer to that question, but it's happening at the same time in the same place. So it's an example of an anecdotal observation that raises our attention and focus. As a science community, we've also been meeting and talking about these events around Australia in previous years and this year. And again, because we had some early signal that Western Australia was going to be a focus, we have a glider program that's run by the Integrated Marine Observing System. And we plan as a community around Australia where we think those gliders should get in the water so that we can get a sense of things like how deep is the extreme temperatures extending. So a glider is this yellow thing in the top left. It can get out and be driven around for a few weeks from land. It dives up and down in the water column. And so in the lower left-hand side here, you see a picture of depth on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And you can get a sense of, if you just look at the top one, how deep does that warm water extend? And so the warm water it looks like we're seeing warm water about 2 or 3 degrees above average down to 100 meters. Claire intimated that the model was showing that, and this is the observations that also show it. So even if we get a cyclone or some winds going over the top, it's not going to mix cool water up to give us relief at the surface. So these observations are really important for us thinking about how quickly will this event relax and disappear. So we've got both the glider program, and a couple of gliders are in the water right now gathering data. There's also Western Australia's got a series of smart buoys that also provide this in-water information. I think that you would want to learn a lot more about these because it's very detailed data and can give you great insights into what's happening in a region. And that's got to be the stuff of the regional briefings. Some examples then. I already mentioned the fish kill that we've all seen in the media. Those of us not living in the Pilbara coast, we couldn't see it firsthand. A mix of species and including things like turtles and sea snakes. And so for me, that says it's probably not just heat, because turtles and sea snakes wouldn't have the same susceptibility as the fish. So warmer water plus something for my view. In this phase that I suggested, they're in the phase 2, response and respond. We're looking at making sure that people who are on the water are recording things. Aquaculture farmers have reported into the team that they're reassessing their operational plans for the summer. If I thought it was going to be a very warm summer as an aquaculture operator, I'd think about, could I aerate water? Could I harvest early? What does that mean about keeping animals healthy with perhaps defouling or other options here? If we had to make a prediction of what we'll see soon, if that warm water moves further south, we'll see tropical species. moving further south. And so putting in place a monitoring approach and giving people a place to report those observations is really important. And unfortunately, given that accumulation of heat that's been observed in the northwest for a few months now, apparently mass bleaching is starting to be observed on inshore reefs. And remember, bleaching is just the loss of the zooxanthellae. If the water cools off, then that coral can recover. If the warming is sustained, then that can lead to coral death. Wrap up by reminding you that as this is a national briefing, we can't go into as much detail for each of the regions. If you'd like to set up a regional briefing and tap into the network of researchers that are following and working on these activities, the FRD's Extension Officer network is your first port of call, and particularly for industry-related briefings, they can use all of these materials and come and have a two-way conversation. And it just helps manage the workload across the research community through using that network. So thanks, Jamie. I'll throw back to you.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, next briefing, March 14th. Let's just keep the slides up for a little bit, Jamie, and then if we get particular questions, we might tab back to them as needed.
Okay. Look, thank you, everyone.